25 years or so ago, I received a Christmas present, a game. How many of you got a game for Christmas this year? Anybody? A few of you got games? I got a game, right? Now, but this game wasn't a computer game because I don't think computers had been invented in my life then. But we had this game, and it wasn't Hungry Hungry Hippos or Snakes and Ladders or anything like that. It was a fully fledged tabletop game. Now, I don't know if you know what these kind of games are like, but you have a game board, which is usually a piece of fabric, and it rolls out over a whole table, and you've got lots of different dice with lots of different sides on it. Did you know dice come with more than 6? And some of these had 14, 20. Yeah, someone's cheering back there. Welcome to the Geeks Lounge here today. And this game had lots of different playing pieces and and it had a deck of cards which were played in throughout the game. And I was very excited to get this game. It's something I'd been asking for. Not unsurprisingly, my friends and I had talked about it. So came along Christmas Day, and we'd opened all the presents and had lunch, and I was finally allowed to go and play this game. And I somehow roped my sisters into playing with me. And I got out the instruction manual. How many of you love to read instruction manuals? You're right? So this thing was like a bajillion pages long. No, seriously, 300 to 400 pages long instruction book. And I don't know whether you know this about me. If you don't, that's fine. I have a short attention span. And not when I'm preaching, so you're lucky. We're going to be here for a while. I got out the instruction manual, a few hundred pages, and I thought, no, this is not going to work. I read the first few pages. This is how to set the game up, the basic mechanics of the game, how to play the game. And I thought, right, we're good. Let's go. Let's play this game. Carol and Belinda, they're my sisters. We're going to play this game. And I tell you what, after about half an hour, I was absolutely sick of it. It was so complicated, so confusing. It was so, I don't know, you'd roll a dice and this would happen and you're like, I don't know why that happened. And then someone would play this card and the whole thing would change on its head, and I was over it. And it didn't help that my sisters were better at it than I was. But after about half an hour, I got totally jack of it. I shoved it in the box and I stuck it in the cupboard, much to my parents' disappointment. Fortunately, 5 or so weeks later, we go back to school. And of course, my friends had wanted this game, and some of them got it for Christmas, and they'd loved it. And I'm like, how could you love this game? It just doesn't make sense. It's like this and that happens. Why does this happen? Why does that happen? And they stopped. They stopped me and they said, look, yeah, you got the mechanics of the game. Like, this is how the dice rolls work, and that's where you move and all this sort of. But you don't understand how to play. And I said, you're right, I don't understand how to play. I don't even know how you're supposed to win the game, which is all I really was interested in. And so they taught me how to play. But see, more than teaching me how to play, the mechanics and the rules and the strategy, they taught me that there was a whole story that went behind the game. Every piece, every move, every dice roll, every card played, every place on the board had a huge backstory. And you know what? If I'd stopped and spent a few hours reading the bajillion-page instruction manual, I would have found that after the first few pages, after the mechanics and the rules and that, was a story. And the story made it all make sense. And I understood why everything happened, because this was part of the backstory and it fitted into the main story overall. And I find that, we did play the game once. We played the game, me and my friends and I, and one game took over 30 hours to play. Did I tell you I have a short attention span? We played it once, that was it. And so, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because Christmas is like that. Religion is like that. History is like that. We need to understand the great arc, the great story that happens behind everything. And it helps us make sense of where the pieces move and how things happen. It's not going to help us make sense of everything, because life is far more complex than a tabletop game. I know, hard to believe, but it helps us make sense of some things. And this morning, we're going to unpack Christmas in a way that will help us understand the place of the Christmas story in human history. And to do that, I want to turn to a famous Christmas text from a Bible letter called Galatians. Do you have a Bible? Do you have a smartphone, I should say? Turn off Facebook and go to a Bible app and look up Galatians chapter 4, which is where we are going to be today. You know, a famous Christmas. No, it's not, is it? It's not a normal Christmas text, but here we are. I did tell Bradley the other day that I was going to talk at Christmas time about adoption. He said, "What?" And I said, "Well, here you go. This is what we're going to talk about. Galatians chapter 4. Now, Paul is the author of this letter, and he's writing to the Galatians, people who live in Galatia, which is a region of the Roman Empire, which is now Turkey, pretty much. The capital of Galatia was Ankara, which is now the capital of Turkey, so there you go. So we're writing to primitive Turkeys. No. We are writing... This is the first century, Roman Empire rules. This is Nero, Caligula, all these people that you hear about from Shakespeare and stories. This is who we're talking about, and this is the era. And he is trying to explain the coming of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, and how it's important in human history. Galatians 1. So I'm going to read a couple of verses and unpack it a little bit, and read a few more, unpack it a little bit, and we'll see where this takes us. All right. Galatians 4, 1 and 2. What I am saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he's no different from a slave. Although he owns the whole estate, the heir is subject to guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. Now, this makes sense. My kids accuse me of treating them like slaves all the time. And it's biblical. I've got to say, it's biblical. But it makes sense, doesn't it? Everyone who was born is really no much different to a slave. Even Prince William, second in line to the royal throne of England, Scotland, Wales, and the British Empire. When he's growing up, he must answer to the rules and regulations of guardians and Mary Poppins type people. You know, he has nannies and parents. And he has to answer to them. And he has to live under their rule. When I was teaching Bradley to drive, we bought him a car. Well, we didn't buy him a car. We bought a car for him to learn to drive because he wanted to learn to drive a manual car. And we didn't have one, so we bought a cheap one. And so it was always kind of considered to be his car. Now, even though it was his car, while he was on his L plates, he's not allowed to drive it on his own, is he? Well, he wasn't, and he didn't, I'm pretty sure. You're not allowed to drive it on your own when you're on L plates, because you always have to have a guardian, a supervisor, someone to sit there at your shoulder and make sure that you're developing the skills, make sure you're developing the abilities, and make sure you're developing the maturity required to drive on the road without being a danger to yourself or others. And of course, then you sit down for an exam and make sure you can prove to an examiner that you've done the same thing. What Paul is saying here is really quite profound. Because he goes on, listen to this in verse 3. He says, "See also, when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world." Paul says, right here, humanity in its primitive stages, that is, BC, before Christ, was given the laws and the religion of the Old Testament. This religion given to Moses was designed to be like that driving instructor. The road rules are the road rules, right? They're always there. But this religious, huge organization of religion was designed to be like that supervisor, the driving instructor. They helped, the rules and the religion, they really did help ancient humanity develop the maturity and the spiritual insight and abilities to ensure that they could get through life successfully, prosperously, and without harming anybody else. But that was before Jesus was born. That was what religion was for before Jesus was born. Because he goes on, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman." See, this is why it's a Christmas text, see? "Born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law," that is the religious machine, "that we might receive adoption to sonship." Now, if you've got an NIV Bible, you will find a little footnote there after this verse. Does anyone have it? If you have to click on the little, tiny little thing. You got it, right? So the note says this. What's the note say? "The Greek word for adoption to sonship is a legal term referring to the full legal standing of an adopted male heir in the Roman culture." Does that sound like a documentary? I'm trying to sound a bit like a documentary. Okay, so this is really, really important, and we need to unpack some history here. So I'm sorry if history class bored you to tears. Please don't cry. Now, in the first century, in Roman society, families were the core of life, right? The family and your extended family was everything. Businesses, all family owned, almost all family owned. Property, family owned. Trading, commerce, politics was all conducted in families. Every extended family is ruled by the senior father, the most senior father, Monsignor, most senior father, the pater familias, if you want the term. And he would rule everything. He would own all the property. He would do all the trading and commerce and politics. Everything conducted by the family was done under this one pater familias. All property was owned, trading, manufacturing, farming, grazing, everything ultimately controlled by the family father. Now, of course, the more aristocratic and the more wealthy the family, the more high up in society, the more staff they would have in their businesses and the more families they would have working for them and adopted into their families. They would have some of the Roman senators, some near the top of Roman society, they would be CEOs of empire-wide businesses. It's like a corporation, except corporations didn't exist, they were all families. So to be this in this society, having a son, an heir, someone to hand on these huge corporations and businesses and interests over to, all this property, was very important. I guess it's similar in the way we understand medieval lords and ladies to happen, to hand it on to the next generation. Big deal. A son or an heir had to be skilled in numbers, politics, negotiation, business. They had to be mature, level-headed, well-spoken and intelligent. But what if there's no son to take on the business? What if there was no son to assume control of the family business, or there's no son who wanted to? Because that happened. Maybe there was no son capable of taking on such a huge task. The solution was adoption. The pater familias, the senior father of life, would go through looking through all his staff and all his slaves and all his people who were working in his family and sometimes outside the family, and he would identify a young man just about to become an adult. You see, so this guy would be about between 14 and 18, and he would show the characteristics required to grow into someone who could take over this incredible business. Ready to step into adulthood, he'd be looking for this worthy candidate, and he would adopt them. And that adopted son would become the son and would inherit the business. And that was how succession planning was organised. Perhaps the most famous example of this is a guy named Octavian. Julius Caesar, right, is a Roman general, didn't have any sons. He adopts a guy by the name of Octavius to be his heir. And when he is assassinated, do you remember Julius Caesar was assassinated by Brutus and others, stabbed in the back and all that sort of story? I don't know, that could just be Shakespeare. But he was assassinated. And of course, the empire is thrown into a bit of a civil war once the emperor is killed. But up rises Octavian, the heir apparent to Julius's empire. And of course, he defeats the others. He is such a great commander. He's a really, really clever leader, an intelligent guy, and he defeats the others and becomes the emperor. And we know him if we read Luke chapter 2, which we've been reading the last few weeks. Luke chapter 2, in verse 1, we hear him because he's changed his name and he's now Caesar Augustus. So Caesar Augustus, one of the greatest leaders of the Roman Empire, was an adopted son of Julius Caesar. So this adoption thing was a big deal, and this is the way it works. So when we read adoption in the Bible, in this text, we have to understand that it's very different. Today, children are usually put up for adoption, right, because they're vulnerable, because their parents are maybe unavailable, unwilling, or unable to take care of them. That's why we do adoption now, right? Back then, they did adoption because the family needed someone. They adopted young men on the cusp of adulthood because they were extraordinary, because they were worthy, because they were brilliant, because they were capable. So here's what he's saying. This is what Paul is saying to the Galatians. God sent Jesus because he determined that the time was right, that you are worthy. Humanity is worthy, extraordinary, and brilliant, and ready for the next era. And the other thing that this signified, this adoption, that it signified whether the boy was adopted from outside the family or whether he's adopted from inside the family, like a blood son. It indicated that they are no longer a child. They're an adult. An adult. This year in our family, we celebrated Bradley's finished exams. You know, he gained entry to university that he wanted. He got his driver's license. There's a lot of things about Bradley's life this year that shows a transition from childhood to adulthood. And yes, I am very proud of him, so I'm going to tell you about him. Sorry, Brad. Put your headphones in. You'll be right. We mark these occasions. In those days, they marked the occasions by taking their sons down to the town square and announcing them. "This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased. He is my son." Same sort of thing God is saying at the right time, when humanity had matured enough. God sent his son as an announcement that he found us worthy. He adopted us as sons. Jesus' birth radically changes things because it is the end of the immature religious relationship with God and the beginning of the mature relational covenant with God. Look what he says in verse 6 and 7. "Because you are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, 'Abba, Father.' You are no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God also made you an heir." When I was growing up, whenever we had huge dinners at home or lunches, say at Christmas time, there'd be a lot of people around, and we'd usually have two tables. Does anybody like this? Anybody have the two-tabled system? One table. How did you determine who goes on one table or who doesn't? Huh? Age. Exactly right. There's the kids' table. And there's the adults' table, yeah? The adults' table would have things like White Christmas, and the kids would just have like lollies. You know, it was, if they started mucking up, you just throw more lollies in that direction, all good. That's right. Georgia caught my lollies. And when I was a kid, I had to sit at the kids' table. And I remember the time when one year I was invited to sit, or a place was just set for me at the adults' table. Felt pretty good, right? Anyone else have that kind of experience? You ever remember? Do not remember? Too old to remember? It's the same in the grand story of humanity, and this is what Christmas is all about. When we were spiritually immature, before Christ, we sat at the kids' table under the supervision of adults with sets of rules and things like, you know, don't throw food. I mean, what a crazy rule. Under these rules and regulations. When Jesus was born, we were invited to sit at his table. He came to us. He treated us like spiritual adults. Our relationship is closer. He rewrote the relationship. No longer is it based on rules, regulations, and religion, but is purely based on relationship. So out here, we've prepared a meal. This is probably not like what you're going to have at home today, but we've prepared a symbolic meal to share together. And I want to be very clear. There might be two tables here, but they're both adult tables. We're going to play some music. And I want to invite all of you to come and to take a glass, a cup of juice, and a piece of bread, and take it with you back to your seat, and we'll talk a little bit more about the significance of that. So if we play the music, no matter how old you are, these might be adults' table, but we're all spiritual adults. That's what Jesus came to say. Everybody in this room is invited to come and to be in relationship with Jesus by coming and sharing a meal with him. Let's do this as the music plays.